Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parsha Rabbit Hole, where I find something interesting that pops out at me from the Parsha and follow it down to its weirdest, most obscure places. This week's Parsha is Parsha's Noach. It talks about the flood, but we're going to start right after the flood.
The skies are clear, the rain's all over, the skies are clear.
After the flood, Hashem very famously makes a rainbow, and that rainbow is a sign of the promise that there will not be any more floods ever again. But there's more details to that promise, and that's where we're going to start out. This is what it says in the Parsha. Oid kol yemei ha'aretz zera v'kotzir v'kor v'choim v'kayetz v'choref v'yoim v'layla lo yishboisu. So long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease.
Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
So the most obvious place to start is always Rashi. And Rashi grabs onto those last words, Yom v'layla lo yishboisu. Day and night will not cease. And this is what Rashi says. Rashi says from those words that Hashem says that day and night won't stop ever again, that implies that day and night did stop during the flood. And Rashi brings a Midrash that says that during the entire time of the flood, lo shimshu hamazoles, the celestial bodies didn't work. So what does that mean, that they didn't work? Did they fall out of the sky? Did time freeze? What does it mean that there was no day and night because the celestial bodies didn't work?
All right, well, it's very nice to meet you all, and why don't you tell us what your problem is?
So this is where the rabbit hole starts. Now, the way a normal Parsha class would work is that you'd have a question at the beginning, and then by the end, you'd answer that question, and it would be inspiring or educate you in some way. But that's not how things work in the rabbit hole. The way the rabbit hole works is we're not trying to answer one particular question. We're just trying to find something that seems promising, something that holds enough amount of weird that we're confident we're going to find plenty of it if we just keep on following. And I think this has enough weird. Lo shimshu hamazoles. It's got space in it. It's got time in it. I think there's some real rabbit hole potential here. So if you're on board with climbing down with me, let's go. So the first thing I did was I took those words, lo shimshu hamazoles, the celestial bodies didn't function, and I typed them into the search box in Sefaria. And what I found was a few different opinions of what exactly that means. We'll start with Maskil David, which is a commentary on Rashi. He asks, what's the function of the mazoles, of the celestial bodies? He says their function is to orbit, to spin around in the sky. Now, let's just accept that in most rabbinic literature that we're going to be looking at, the model we're going to be working with is a geocentric model where everything in the sky is spinning around the earth. So he says, what does it mean that the sun and the moon stopped working? It means that they stopped moving around.
Our problem is we don't know where we belong.
But that doesn't mean that they stopped making light. He actually says that they stopped moving precisely when the flood began, in early morning when both the sun and moon are out. And because of that, there was actually a little bit of light during the entire time of the flood. But he says that's how it stayed the entire time. So there was no day and night because it was just daybreak for the entire year.
And this was all because it was the middle of the night.
Okay, so now we've got one definition of lo shimshu hamazoles, the heavenly bodies stopped working. What does that mean? According to Maskil David, it means they stopped moving, but they still made a little bit of light. Now we're going to see the opposite from Mizrahi. Mizrahi says that the sun and the moon were still moving around in the sky. And even though usually we define day and night by the setting and rising of the sun and the moon, in this case, he says, they were dark. And we only define day and night by the rising of the sun when the sun is actually shining. But in this case, it wasn't shining. So according to Mizrahi, during the entire time of the flood, lo shimshu hamazoles, the heavenly bodies didn't work. What does that mean? It means they went dark. So now we've got two different opinions. According to Maskil David, they stopped spinning around, but they were still shining. And according to Mizrahi, they were spinning around, but they stopped shining. I found a few different variations on those two ideas, but I think those two are a good representation. But now we're going to look at a third way of looking at this from Chassidus, from Jewish mysticism. This is from Shem Mishmuel, which is an early Hasidic work from the Sukkot Rebbe. And what he says is that Noach and all of his family and all of the animals, when they were on the Teva, the ark, it was like they were in a completely different world. He actually uses the term mazel differently than we have been using it. We've been using it to refer to the actual physical celestial bodies themselves, the sun and the moon and the stars. But there's another way that the term mazel gets used in Torah. Some of you might be surprised to know that within Jewish belief, there is actually ideas of astrology. Astrology has a place in rabbinic literature, in the Midrash and in the Talmud. And the word mazel refers to the constellations in the sky, the stars that have some sort of influence in the world.
My horoscope said I should be careful today or some great physical harm could befall me.
Oh, that's a lot of silly superstition.
The way Shem Mishmul describes it is that the mazolis, the astrological signs, are a means through which life force is distributed into all living things in the world. But since he says that every living thing was in a different world, on the Teva, on the Ark, then the mazolis weren't doing anything. They weren't distributing any life force because every living thing was getting their life force directly given to them on the Teva. So the mazolis, the astrological signs, weren't working. So now we've got three different answers to what that original phrase, Le Shimshu HaMazolis, the celestial bodies were not working, what that means. One is that they stopped spinning around, but they were still making light. Two is that they stopped making light, but they were still spinning around. And three is they stopped giving some sort of spiritual force into the world because nothing needed it, because they were on the ark being cocooned by God. So that's already pretty cool. We've got three different ways of looking at this idea, and they're all pretty neat. But the rabbit hole doesn't stop there. Commentaries on the actual verses in the Parsha are kind of the tip of the rabbit hole iceberg. I know, I'm mixing metaphors. What I really like to do, if I can, is see if this word comes up in halacha. See if it gets applied into Jewish law. And what I found when I typed L'Shimshu HaMazolis into the box was a tshuva, or responsum, by Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, the Ben Ish Chai. Now, tshuves, or responsa, are a rabbit hole treasure trove. I know, I'm mixing metaphors again. Deal with it. A tshuva is kind of like a rabbit hole in and of itself. It takes a halachic question and answers it, but it doesn't just give you an answer, the final ruling, what you should do, like Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, does. The way a tshuva works is it takes you down the windy path of figuring out that answer. So I was pretty excited when I found a tshuva that dealt with this topic. And this is what it says. It talked about people who live in polar regions where days and nights can sometimes last for many days. This is a topic that's been dealt with exhaustively in halacha. And the answer that you might be familiar with is that people who live in places where the sun isn't rising and setting every day should use 24-hour days. The Ben Ish Chai brings a proof from our situation. He says that during the flood, there were days. How do we know? Because the Torah explicitly says that the flood lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. So even though there was no day and night where it got light and dark, there still were days and nights. And the flood lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And therefore he says that's a proof that people who live in a place where the sun isn't making days and nights, they still have days and nights, and they should just count 24-hour periods. Now, this is a fun idea, and it often gets used by people as one of the more quirky and interesting ideas in Torah. But it's not quirky and interesting enough for the rabbit hole. We need to get weirder. Fortunately, I realized that this little chunk from this tshuva is actually an aside. It's not what the tshuva is actually about. What it's actually about is something much cooler. Teleportation.
Scotty, beam me up.
The real term in Hebrew is kefitzas haderech, which means bending of the path. It's used in rabbinic literature and Midrash and in the Talmud to talk about people traversing great distances in a very short amount of time. I've seen different explanations for the exact way that it works, but the bottom line is that we're talking about somebody getting from point A to point B in a lot less time than it should take. So back to the tshuva. The Ben Ish Chai says that we know that the way the world works is that the day starts at different times based on where you are. That people in the east, the day starts earlier, and in the west, it starts later. Therefore, you have a situation every single week where it's Shabbos in one place and not Shabbos in another. It's still the weekday, or it's already the weekday. So his question is, what if somebody starts Shabbos in a place where Shabbos comes in very late? and then, through the recitation of a divine name and through kafitzas haderech, which I'm going to be translating here as teleportation, travels instantly to a place where Shabbos comes in and goes out earlier, so that it comes out that that person has not observed a full day, a full 24 hours of Shabbos. So his question is, does that person have to observe a full 24 hours of Shabbos? And even after the sun goes down and everyone else is making Havdalah, that person still has to wait a few more hours? Or do we say that Shabbos, for that person and for everybody else, goes with the sun? And when the sun goes down, Shabbos is over, even though this person only observed 18 hours of Shabbos or less. Now he brings a lot of different proofs for this back and forth and shows how each one proves it and then disproves the proof.
Certain questions get answered, others spring up. The mind plays tricks on you, you play tricks back.
But I'm going to focus on one of them. The second proof he brings, and we're going to skip the first, is a story from the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, about the day that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who wrote the Mishnah, passed away. It says that on the day that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi passed away, there were many miracles. It says that his funeral extended for a very long time, that they stopped at 18 different shuls, and people eulogized for many, many hours, and that it was Erev Shabbos, it was a Friday afternoon, but the sun didn't set until everybody had a chance to get home, fill up a barrel of water, and light Shabbos candles. But as soon as the sun did set, the rooster crowed. And then everyone started getting nervous because they thought that time froze when the sun wasn't setting. But now that the rooster crowed, they got nervous that maybe time was passing and Shabbos had actually come in while the sun was still out. So everybody got scared, but a voice came out from the heavens, a bas kol, a heavenly voice came out and said, everybody who participated in the levaya, the funeral of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, has a cheluk in olam haba, a share in the world to come. Except for one particular guy, a fuller, which is a person who washes wool in part of the wool making process. So everybody gets a cheluk in olam haba, which means that they weren't violating Shabbos, except for this one guy. So this one guy gets very upset, and he climbs to the roof and jumps off and dies. And then a bas kol comes out and says, including the fuller. Now, I think that the way that most people interpret this is that this act of self-sacrifice retroactively included the person in this group of people who were at Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's funeral. But the way I like to read it is that the bas kol made a correction and was like, oh yeah, never mind, this guy is included, but now it's too late because he fell off a roof. Either way, it's a wild story. So now back to the tshuva. The Ben Ish Chai tries to use this as a proof for our situation. Remember, our original question was somebody who teleports and ends up with a Shabbos that doesn't have a complete 24 hours, do they have to keep a complete 24 hours or not? And he says that this story could be an example of people who had a Shabbos that was not a full 24 hours, and it was fine. They were okay. The bas kol, the heavenly voice, came out and said, you're all good, right? Because the sun set and it was Shabbos, and then the rooster crowed and the sun came up again, and they didn't have a full night, and the night was shortened, and therefore they didn't have a full 24 hours of Shabbos, and yet this heavenly voice came out and said, it's all good, except for one guy. But the Ben Ish Chai says, you can't use this as a proof. He says, I think that that Shabbos in this story was a full 24 hours. And what I think is that the rooster was wrong.
And my job is to tell it like it is, or was, or whatever.
So this is what he says. He says, why did the rooster crow? Because that's the nature of roosters. They crow every 24 hours. They crow 24 hours since the last time they crowed. So even though the sun had just set and there was going to be a full night before it would rise again, the rooster didn't know that. The rooster doesn't crow when the sun comes out. The rooster crows based on its internal clock. And therefore, he says, the rooster crowed early. The sun did not rise when the rooster crowed. It rose after a full 12 hours or however many hours there were of night. And there was a full 24 hours of Shabbos. And therefore, he says, you can't use this as a proof.
It's like you're unraveling a big cable knit sweater that someone keeps knitting and knitting and knitting.
Now, before we go on to the actual answer that's given, I wanted to check this out. Is that true, that roosters just crow every 24 hours based on their internal clock and not based on the sun? Or is there some sort of mechanism inside the rooster that reacts to the sun? Apparently the answer is a little bit of both. There have actually been studies done where they took a bunch of roosters and made it so that they couldn't see the sun and gave them various different random stimuli of light and sound and tested whether or not they would crow at the right time. And apparently the result is that more often than not, they crowed when the sun rose. Why? Because of their internal clock, the circadian rhythm of the rooster. Now, apparently that can get thrown off if you keep on depriving them of the natural stimuli. But for a while, it'll work. So I guess according to the Ben Ish Chai, that's what was happening here, that this rooster's internal clock counted 24 hours after the last time it crowed, and crowed even though the night wasn't over yet. Okay, so now on to the answer. After giving a bunch of proofs and trying to create precedent this way and that, trying to answer one way or another, the Ben Ish Chai says we can answer this logically, based on a verse from Chumash that says, on Shabbos, don't light a fire, b'kol moshvei seichem, in all the places you live. He says, that's how Shabbos works, b'kol moshvei seichem, in all the places you live. Shabbos starts when sun sets in the place that you are, and it ends when the sun sets the next day, the place that you are. And the reality is that sometimes it's Shabbos in one place and it's not Shabbos in another place. And therefore, he says, the answer to our question, somebody who begins Shabbos somewhere where it starts late and then teleports to somewhere where it ends earlier and therefore doesn't have a full 24 hours of Shabbos, Shabbos would end for that person when the sun sets. And then he gives a funny example. He says, if you would try to tell that person, no, you have to make up the extra hour so you have a full day of Shabbos, he said that would be like if somebody didn't keep Shabbos on Saturday and then on Sunday said, oh, I'm going to make up Shabbos and keep Shabbos today on Sunday, which he says would be ridiculous. And therefore he says the same is true of the teleporter. Once the sun sets, Shabbos is over, and it doesn't matter how many hours of Shabbos they experienced. Now, this has already been a very exciting adventure down the rabbit hole. But before we end, there was something that was bothering me. This idea that it can be Shabbos in one place and not Shabbos in another place is kind of weird. How exactly does it work? And that can apply to really anything in Judaism that has a specific time. How does that time work? Why is it that this thing is bound to the time in the place that it's at? And really, it kind of separates us all. Because we're supposed to have one Torah, all of the Jews doing the mitzvah together. We're all observing Shabbos. We're all observing Yom Tov. We're all doing these mitzvahs at the same time, but we're not. So how does that work? And I remembered something that I had actually learned about 20 years ago in yeshiva. Every day in yeshiva we had Halacha Seder, an hour where we had to learn Shulchan Aruch. And I actually ditched most of that and would go into the library and learn a bunch of other random books. And the times where I actually did learn the halachas that I was supposed to, I don't remember a lot of it. But this one I did remember, because it did something interesting. This is a piece from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, and the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch is unique in that it doesn't just give rulings, it gives rulings with reasons. But this piece does even more. It kind of feels like Hasidus, like Jewish mysticism, right in the middle of a Jewish legal ruling. And this is what the Alter Rebbe says. He's talking about Chatzos, Halachic midnight. And the Alter Rebbe says this time of midnight is an Eis Ratzain. It's an auspicious time, Lamaila, above. And then he answers our question. He says, the fact that this happens at different times throughout the world, it's staggered throughout the day depending on where you are from east to west.
What if they're eating in an airplane and they cross a time zone? I mean, it's always midnight somewhere.
He says, Ein bekach klum. This means nothing. And he says this actually applies to Shabbos and Yom Tov and saying Shema and to the times of davening, the times of tefillah. Any mitzvah that has a specific time. He says all of these things, all of these mitzvahs come from a realm that transcends space and time. And then they shine below into each place in their appropriate time. So it comes out that whenever Jews are doing a mitzvah that is bound to a specific time, what's happening is we're like jumping out of our actual normal time-space continuum and switching into some sort of like prime timeline, which then gets distributed into like infinite sub-timelines throughout space. So therefore, according to this, it comes out that when any Jew is doing a mitzvah that has a specific time, whether it be saying Shema, or keeping Shabbos, or putting out tefillin at the right time, or lighting Shabbos candles, whatever it is, if we're doing a mitzvah that has a specific time, it turns out we're all doing that together, even when we're not doing it together, which I think is pretty cool. All right, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. If you want to yell at me about how the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, go for it. Do that in the comments below, even though I already explained it. And as usual, if you ask any questions in the comments that lead me down another rabbit hole, maybe I'll try to make a video about that during the week. Okay, thank you for joining me down the rabbit hole. I hope you find your way out.